you realize that all the rivers are full of stories and history, but the stories of people. And I like to tell that history through the stories of people.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation, in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
Man, college feels like a long time ago, but I do remember a few things about my experience there. For example, I once had to give a speech for a speech class, go figure, about having an adventure. I'm pretty sure that I had had some adventures before this point, but instead of choosing one of those, a friend and I decided to do a 3-day canoe trip down the Wapsipinicon River in eastern Iowa from Calamus, or maybe it was Calamus. That's one of the things I don't remember from college, but from Calamus to where it reaches the Mississippi near what was then his home in the Quad Cities. I don't know exactly how many miles that was because there were no Google Maps in those days. And as I do recall, our trip was a little low on planning, and it turned out a little heavy on rain. We made it to the first night, pretty much soaked through and through, and camped on the edge of a muddy farm field with no prospects for a campfire. I don't even remember that we had a tent. By noon the next day, we pulled the plug. Actually, what we did is we pulled the canoe over to the side of the river at a bridge, we hiked to a nearby store, and we called my friend's father from a payphone, and he came and picked us up, and that was the end of the adventure. I have no memory of how the speech went. Anyway, writer Peter Lourie had a canoe adventure around the same year, actually, but on a different river, the Hudson, traveling from its source on Mount Marcy all the way to Manhattan. And it was more successful. Successful enough, in fact, that it spawned a book called River of Mountains. The book's 30th anniversary edition is just coming out, and Peter Lourie joined me from Vermont to explain how that trip has influenced his career in the years since.
I think of all my adventures, and I have 26 books, and most of them are kids' books, but many of them focus on adventures in Latin America and various places. And out of all of them, the Hudson River trip, although it's sort of the most domestic and the closer to home, is one of the greatest trips of my life. And I think that's because it happened very early in my marriage. My daughter was 1 year old. We were living in Beacon, New York. I was a little antsy, and I was teaching at the master's school. And my wife said to me, you look like you need a project. And so I looked out the window and saw the Hudson River, and I realized I'd never really been on it. So why don't I take an adventure on the Hudson? And my original idea, I'd been overseas. I'd been in Ecuador, and I had already written a book that was coming up for publication about Incan treasure. And I had been in the Amazon of Brazil, and I was writing my first children's book about the loss of the jungle and everything. But I was so excited to be able to do an adventure close to home, because that way I could get home if I needed to. I could call home, I could be close to home, but I could also have one of the greatest adventures of my life. I didn't realize that the river ran, 315 miles all the way from Lake Tier of the Clouds on Mount Marcy through rapids and dams and locks and tides all the way down to Manhattan. And so I think it was the curiosity and the exploration of the river that excited me, and also getting out of the house for 3 weeks. I figured I could probably do it for 3 weeks, And my wife said, "Look, I'll give you a month, but you really, I got to have a mother's helper, and you got a month. That's it,
Well, and
So,
as you pointed out, a month was like was a 12th of your daughter's life.
yeah, it was a huge chunk of her life, and that proved to be a little complex because she needed me more than I realized. Pete Seeger lived in Beacon, and I remember him telling me before I left, he said, don't do what I did. Make sure you stay home as much as possible. Don't travel too much. But here I go on another adventure. the first of her life, seeing her dad disappear. And so I originally wanted to go from Manhattan to Lake Tyr because I thought the idea was metaphorically great because you could go from this sort of maw of industrial civilization to this beautiful, pristine lake. I'd been to the Adirondacks in Tupper Lake area all my life, and I wanted to aim for that beauty. But when I started talking to people, and I realized I could easily paddle the first 154 miles to the Troy Dam because it's all tides, and you can take the flood tide going north on the river that flows two ways. But that if the river starts to get a little, it has a current, and then there's whitewater, and it gets to be a real problem. So I changed directions and wanted to take one craft, one canoe, and hired a guide for the upper whitewater section that I had to learn about, knew nothing about.
This is Ernie.
Yeah, Ernie LaPrairie was my guide, a wonderful rafter and Adirondack guide up in Blue Mountain Lake, and he helped me get through the whitewater, and then I was alone from Lake Luzerne all the way down to Manhattan. And again, coming home after 2.5 weeks was one of the great experiences of my life. Also, because when I got home, I wanted to surprise my family and didn't tell Melissa I was coming that day. I told her I was coming the next day, and I paddled from Poughkeepsie early in the morning at about 6 a.m. I left Poughkeepsie and got up to the Beacon Dock and grabbed my paddles and cameras and went up to the house and opened the door. And when I walked in, I felt like a thief. I felt like like I'd been away 1,000 years and like I didn't belong there anymore. And I opened the door and I walked in, and I could hear Susanna babbling on a hot summer day, and she was stuck in her playpen and not exactly happy about that. And I walked around the corner, and she saw me and hadn't seen me in, I think, 1/24 of her life, one huge chunk. And she looked at me, she looked down, and she just wouldn't acknowledge I was there. I mean, she was punishing me. And then she raised her hand, and I picked her up, and then she, put her head in my neck and said, "Dad, Dad, Dad, Dad." And it was just wonderful coming home. I spent a night there, and then I had to get 3 more days to get to Manhattan. So nobody had ever really done this trip before. A lot of people talk about it. A lot of people want to take a trip down the Hudson. In fact, recently, when the New York Times Book Review podcast came out, and Greg Coles was talking about, one of the editors was talking about my book. He was reading it in research for Riverman by another author. He says he always wanted to do the whole Hudson. So it's a thing. People want to travel the whole Hudson. But I didn't do it for the novel feat. I did it because I really just wanted to explore the history and learn all about the place and also have an adventure close to home.
It sounds like this trip that took place 3.5 decades ago is still pretty fresh in your mind.
It's fresh because I did school programs for 30 years, and it formed the basis for my one-man show. It's kind of like a swimming to Cambodia. I mean, there are probably people listening to this show who heard me in the 4th grade, since the 4th grade was, is when they study the Hudson River in New York State and local history, so to speak. I was brought into the 4th grade and the 7th grade, and I did programs for 30 years. I must have talked to 1 million kids. And what happened was, when the publisher of the children's book, which came out first, decided they wanted to send me into schools, they sent a letter out to the up and down the river and said, "Peter would love to come into your school and talk about his adventure." Well, I'd never done that before, but I got a carousel of slides, and I went in and I developed this program, which I'd been doing. I did really up until the pandemic.
When you think about 30 or 35 years, you just mentioned the carousel of slides, which is something that, I think if we talked to some 4th graders today, they would have no idea what we're talking about. But 30 or 35 years is just a blip in the history of the Hudson River. But to read this book and read about your adventure in 2024, in some ways, it feels like visiting a completely different period in history.
Yeah, it was even then it was like stepping back into history because I I took a fascination for all the logging and the brick making along the Newburgh area and the ice, the industry. I took a fascination, and I was fascinated with talking with local people and historians about the river. So in a way, you enter by paddling this river from the beginning to the end, you enter all these mini histories along the way, and you discover different time periods of the river. And now, 35 years ago, it does feel like history, but it feels so alive. And that's the curious thing about the Hudson for me is that of all my adventures, this one seems to live with me the longest. And Syracuse University has kept this book, River of Mountains, in print since 95. And it's wonderful to be with the university press. It's wonderful to be local, and it's wonderful to see the depth of history along the river, you know.
The Hudson, at least the part from its source to the point south of Glens Falls where it widens out and navigation is much easier, at least in the period where you write this, it felt like you were almost an explorer. I mean, not that there weren't people that knew the river, but it was a much less well-known part of the Hudson River. Do you think that's changed in 30 or 35 years?
No, actually, I don't. It's amazing how little people really know about the whole river. And the great thing about this journey was that I felt like I could explore the whole thing and tie it together in some ways. And to me, maybe that's the writer in me, but the desire to communicate a whole, you know. And so it's made up of many parts and many people, but it has a kind of an integrity to it that I was able to explore, you know.
Well, I think the other thing that hits you when you read this book is that it's not just an adventure story. You really are kind of introducing us to the characters who really characterize the various parts of the river. I mean, I was really struck by the culture of the lock keepers in the Glens Falls area, for example, and you know, and the people who work the garnet mines, and it was interesting to discover that these each had kind of their own distinctive culture and history to them.
Well, that's a really good question and a really good point, because what makes adventuring so exciting, and the reason I've enjoyed teaching adventure writing and digital storytelling at Middlebury College and various University of Vermont and various places, is the people. You know, it's really getting students excited about a mentor when they're doing a project. But in this case, I'm meeting mentors all the way along. You know, the whole Barton Garnet mines. I was just back there talking with Ernie LaPrairie 35 years later, talking to Peter Barton, who I had met on the river back in 1990, and that's the biggest garnet mine in the world, and who knows about that? There's a whole thing that's going on in North River that's fascinating. And then you get down, like you said, you get down to the locks and the lock tenders, and there was, I don't think that culture has the kind of integrity that it once had, where people pass those jobs on the way miners pass on jobs from generation to generation. That kind of has gone by the wayside, I think. But there is a kind of a world that exists, and I was able to meet tugboat captains and lock tenders and people, and really do some serious discussion with them and find out what they knew. A lot of that is past.
And with the locks, it sounds like it was in the process of going by the wayside even as you were taking that trip.
One of the fun things about thinking about retraveling the Hudson in the opposite direction, in this case, I'm going to actually do it, and I'm not going to paddle the whole way, but because I'm an elderly gent, it'll be the trip of an elderly fella. But so I'll be able to travel in different forms of traveling, because it's not about a feat and accomplishing a great, like, you know, I'm the first to do it, but it's about seeing it again. And one of the great things about going back is seeing that canal, the feeder canal, the little 7-mile canal, has been rejuvenated. There's parks, people are walking around. There's parks all up and down the lower river, Parks and Rec and Scenic Hudson, and people have done an incredible job. I go back to Beacon, where I was, and I can't believe that the old industrial area of the Nabisco plant is now park, and people are renting kayaks. It has this sort of magic quality of being something almost reborn and rejuvenated. It's fantastic.
How did both the trip itself and also the process of writing about it, both the children's book and this adult travel log, how did it shape everything that came after? Do you feel like you learned something about the work of doing this that has shaped
That's
everything that's come since?
That's a great question because really I did learn from this trip that who you meet along the way and not just the help they give you, but the information and the honesty and the willingness to share their stories is what makes, I think, everything I did subsequently exciting. Whether I was in the Arctic or Africa or Latin America or the jungle, it was all about the people. And this story is really about the people along the way. They're all so wonderful, and some of them not so wonderful. But I traveled up the Missouri River with William Least-Heat-Moon when he was writing his book River Horse, and you realize that all the rivers are full of stories and history, but the stories of people. And I like to tell that history through the stories of people. And I think that's what I really learned from this trip. And then I went on to many other adventures, and they came really out of this experience. Also, I think, like I wrote in the book, that when you're in a canoe or you're in some slow boat, you work your way somewhere, and then people are kind of, wow, let me talk to you. You just did some hard work, and they give you a hand, and it's kind of wonderful.
One of the things that amazes me is that this all took place before the internet, really. I mean, it was like very early stages of email in those days, but certainly you did the research for this in a pre-internet world, and yet the news of your trip spread ahead of you on the river to the degree that there's this wonderful scene where you pull your canoe over to the side and you walk into the closest building, and it turns out to be a place where they make false teeth, and they had all heard of you.
Yeah, you're right. I just went back to that area and met a guy named Fritzy who heard of me, and I gave him a copy of the book, and I'm hoping to camp there, right where the Northway goes across. And I couldn't believe that he remembered the whole story and everything. Yeah, it's amazing how the story of my trip kind of traveled, and those people, the bishops, I think are gone. I just went back there at the beginning of the feeder canal, and their building's not there. So I don't know if they still have the business, but I'm going to look into that.
Well, and the other thing that hits you is that the girl who you're holding in the picture on the last page of this book is now an adventurer herself.
Yeah, Susanna is amazing, and I just hope I didn't over promote myself as an adventurer because I'm terrified of that stuff. I'm, bungee jumping, no way, no thank you. I went up last year. I drove from Tucson in a snowstorm and got to Ouray, and she took me out, and I could go up maybe 20 feet, and then I had to back off, and then I go up another 20 feet, and I come back. Finally, on the third 20-foot climb of the baby hill, the baby cliff, I just decided it wasn't for me. So she's far more adventurous, but she has this image, I think, of her dad as being a little braver than he is.
And I'm sure hearing about your various travel exploits through the course of her childhood had to shape that part of her life in some significant way, right?
I think it did. It was tough on her because I was away. As a dad, when you take trips and you go away, and I would go away not just for the adventures once or twice a year, but also for school programs, and I would go to Texas for a week and stuff. And I think that's really particularly tough, especially when you have a younger brother and he may be getting some more attention than you'd like. But I am excited about this new trip that I'm going to do.
So where do things stand on that? You're planning at this point to make the trip from south to north.
Yeah, as I originally wanted to do. I'm just not going to try to paddle the whole way. I'm going to take a kayak. I've been down since I decided well, what happened was I was walking in the mountains in Tucson, and I had been thinking about needing a project, now that I'm getting older and stuff, and I'm not writing any more children's books right at the moment. I thought, well, I need a project. And I thought, what about hiking the whole Arizona Trail, which is this sort of man-made joining of trails of 800 miles from the north to the south, south to the north. And I said, well, no. And then I suddenly thought of the Hudson. How many times do people get an opportunity to go back and sort of do an adventure again. And not only that, to be able to do an adventure like this again in a different direction, but also having lived for 35 years in between, which is really the window of one's life. When you think about it from the moment, I mean, I was an older dad, but I really was starting to work, and you get out there to work, to pay for insurance and houses and all that stuff, and you work your tail off till now when the kids are gone and having, lives of their own. There's a life. And in that life of 35 years, which is a window, I did all these other adventures. So for me, this trip is possibly also a trip into memory, and a trip of learning new history, of course, and meeting new people and some of the same people and seeing how the river's changed. But then again, how have I changed? One of the things, for instance, that's so exciting is that, when I began, marriages are tough. And Melissa and I, we struggled like everybody else. We struggled through these 3.5 decades. Now, I think I'm in love for the first time with my wife. And in some ways, that's a theme for a trip like this. So it wouldn't necessarily be a chapter by chapter book, but it would be also an opportunity to maybe explore memoir a little bit.
It sounds like a memoir as seen through a trip up memory river, if you will.
I have many, many things. If I'm lucky enough to be able to pull it all together, and it may be a completely different kind of story, but it's a bookend, isn't it? I mean, it's one of the bookends of my life, and I'm not promoting this as some great thing. It's just that how lucky am I if I can sort of begin to think what's in between those bookends,
Well, and hopefully your wife will let you out of the house again for 3 weeks or a month.
She still likes it when I go. She's very independent. She started the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival. We kind of did that together, but she did it with her partner, Terry O'Brien, 35 years ago. She was very, very busy, and she started a new theater up here in Middlebury, and she is very independent. And one of the great things about the way we've been able to be over the last 35 years is have our independence. That's allowed us a kind of freedom or space to be able to really come together.
Well, it's a great story, and this is a classic case of to be continued, because I would love to talk to you again as hopefully this trip comes together.
Well, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it and think it through a little bit, and thank you very much.
The 30th anniversary edition of Peter Lourie's book, River of Mountains, is out from Syracuse University Press. Lourie now lives outside Middlebury, Vermont, which is where we reached him by Zoom. Ethan Shanty, though, is just down the hall in another studio, in fact, ready to tell us all about who is responsible for this production.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, edited, and produced by Mitch Tyke, with digital production supervision by me, Ethan Shanty. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, Bill Hanel is our digital director, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To support this show and find more podcasts, visit ncpr.org. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.